Okay, my name is Matt Bowker, and I manage Rhodes Scholars' virtual lecture series. And it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture. And today, you will be hearing from Dominic Bryan. Dominic is a professor of anthropology at Queen's University in Belfast. His research focuses on Irish history, public ritual, nationalism, and group identity. In particular, he has examined the role played by symbols and rituals during the conflict and peace in Northern Ireland. He is also the co-chair of the Commission on Flags, Identity, Culture, and Tradition. So let's have a warm virtual welcome for Dominic.
Thank you very much, Matt, and good morning to everyone. Of course, it's afternoon sitting here in North Belfast. It's usually, as usual, a fairly grey and dull Belfast. Something they often don't tell you in the tourist brochures is that actually Ulster only has three times the year. We have a spring, we have an autumn, and we have a winter. Summer seems to pass us by. And I'm sitting here because of we're just coming out of lockdown here. So I'm still sitting here in my bedroom doing all my work from the bedroom while the kids are running around the house. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to follow on from last week's lecture. Just in case there was no listening last week, I'll do a quick review. And I'm going to talk broadly about the peace process in Northern Ireland. So last week I talked about how the state was set up, the state of Northern Ireland was set up. I talked about the issues with the nature of the state. And I talked about how violence developed particularly from 68, 69 onwards after a civil rights movement. And we had 30 years of conflict reaching up to a peace process. And that's what I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on and explain how it worked. I think it's particularly interesting because the mechanisms of the Northern Ireland peace process have been repeated in other places around the world. So to a certain extent, Northern Ireland became a little bit of a model for peace processes, and I'm perfectly happy I'm not selling it in any way. In fact, I've got my own criticisms of it. So it's quite interesting to look at the strengths and the weaknesses of the peace process in Northern Ireland. I'll try and do that as I go. So to quickly breeze over what we did, what we talked about last week, the two ethnic groups in Northern Ireland. There's more than two ethnic groups, but the two large ethnic groups, which I'm going to describe as either Protestant and Catholic, or sometimes as nationalist or unionist and nationalist. All right, so that's the first interesting thing. When I use the words Protestant and Catholic, I'm not usually referring to religion. I know that sounds odd, but I'm really talking of a broad ethnic group. Those people who see themselves as Protestant usually see themselves as British and unionists, and those people who see themselves as Catholic usually see themselves as nationalist, Irish nationalists. Sometimes we would use the word Republican as well, Catholic and Republican. And there's a complicated link between those identities. All right, so if we started getting into it, I could do another lecture on, for instance, many people in the Irish Republican movement would be socialist and therefore would not be enthusiastic about religion. So not necessarily hugely Catholic. So that it is a complex set of relationships. But an important thing to say, and this will come back when I talk about the agreement in a few minutes' time, is that broadly culturally, they're very similar to each other. If you're over here, you'd struggle to find the difference between a Protestant and a Catholic, all right? They broadly have the same religious beliefs, same rituals, same language. So that on the whole, people who arrive in Northern Ireland, particularly now, find it quite difficult to understand why there is a conflict or where the conflict is. If it wasn't for, and we finished with this last week, the clear divides, the physical divides between communities. We have walls that divide Protestant and Catholic areas, but culturally they come from the same backgrounds, they seem to use the same languages, and in a way they have the same histories. Now, their way of telling the history may differ. So in other words, you take a battle like the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, they have a different take on the result of the battle, but in a sense, they have a common history as well that binds them together in their antagonism. which is part of what is so common in ethnic conflict around the world. The maintenance of the boundaries between these groups is an everyday factor. So when people meet each other, they learn to talk about themselves or others in ways which allow people to understand what group they're from. And in the main, people therefore avoid talking politics and religion because people want to get on with each other. They're broadly friendly. So we have social mechanisms to keep our social world here friendly and peaceful. People do not want to be at war with each other. So in everyday interactions, these people who are very culturally similar have ways of telling who's from which community. All right. And that, again, that'll come back and I'll make some comments about that later. So last week I mentioned the nature of the state, the setting up of Northern Ireland in 1921. I mentioned that it was ultimately a piece of political utility. Nobody demanded a Northern Ireland. Unionists had firstly wanted the whole of Ireland to stay in the United Kingdom, and then wanted 9 counties of Ulster to stay in the United Kingdom. In the end, 6 counties stayed in. So there was no romantic notion about Northern Ireland. You hadn't got what you got in Dublin, which is theatre, poetry, music, song about what Ireland is. You had a romantic notion about this, even though quite a lot of that romantic stuff had been invented in the late 19th, earliest 20th century. All right. But nevertheless, there was a romantic notion of what it was to be Irish and in Ireland. Northern Ireland was pragmatically set up for political reasons so that you had a majority of Protestants over Catholics in the north, a majority of Unionists over nationalists. All right. So although people here saw themselves as British, or 2/3 of people saw themselves British, the actual area of Northern Ireland has always had a struggle inventing itself. To put it in the context of the rest of the United Kingdom, where you've got Wales and England and Scotland, all of those places have romantic notions about what they are. They all have a form of nationalism. Northern Ireland didn't have that. So some of those insecurities over the next 30 and 40 years led to discrimination against Catholics who were seen as a threat to the state. And you could argue they were a threat to the state. So you got high levels of discrimination, which led to a civil rights movement in the 1960s, and then a very violent conflict. The legitimacy of the state collapsed, essentially, at the beginning of the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, producing what's widely known as the Troubles. That's from 1969 to 1998. And certainly for the first half of that period, violence dominated. Politics was trying to catch up. The local assembly, the local parliament at Stormont in 1972 was prorogued. All right, so London started running Northern Ireland directly. So there was so politics stopped working in Northern Ireland. Violence and security became the key ways, and I described last week some of those elements. But I mean, the key numbers to know is that over 3,500 people died. The majority of those, or more than half of those, were civilians. They were non-combatants. In other words, they weren't in the army or the police or in the paramilitary groups, the IRA, the UDA, or the UVF. All right. So there were many victims in awfully traumatic events, shootings and car bombs. And by the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, there was a sense in which the protagonists, the violent protagonists, had run out of ideas. So, for example, the Irish Republicans, the IRA, were going to kick the Brits out of Ireland. They were going to fight until Britain left of Ireland. And it became clear that, in fact, they were not going to achieve that Britain wasn't leaving. On the other hand, the British state would say, we're going to defeat terrorism. All right, we're going to get rid of the IRA. We're going to defeat terrorism. It had also become clear by then that they were unable to do that. So in some senses, after that period of time, the violent strategies that were used by different protagonists had shown themselves to be ineffective. All right, and we had a return to politics. The Republican movement, the IRA, in the form of their political party, Sinn Féin, from 81 onwards, from the hunger strike onwards, started participating in politics and successfully participating in politics. And although their candidates that won elections to become MPs in Westminster would never take their seats because they didn't recognise the legitimacy of the Westminster government, they were participating in the political life. And that became it became more and more clear to many key Republicans that that was the way forward. And so in 1998, we ended up with what sometimes is known as the Good Friday Agreement, sometimes it's known as the Belfast Agreement. And needless to say, this being Northern Ireland, they couldn't get an agreement on what the agreement should be called. So unionists tend to call it the Belfast Agreement. Nationalists tend to call it the Good Friday Agreement. I've therefore just called it the agreement. It was signed on Good Friday, 1998. In actual fact, I'll tell you a secret, it wasn't signed. Nobody signed it. They just nodded their heads. And secondly, I think it was done on Saturday morning at about 2 o'clock in the morning. I was sitting watching the news, waiting for this to come through. So I think technically it wasn't even done at Good Friday. And this is the key part. This is the key part to understanding how ethnic politics works, really. We had a referendum. So I'll go through what the agreement had in it, all right? We had a referendum across the island of Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, because the agreement meant the Irish state changing some parts of its constitution. There was a massive yes that this agreement should be supported. In Northern Ireland, it was more problematic because a few Republicans and nationalists felt that they should still keep fighting. But unionists were deeply suspicious of this because it would mean that Irish Republicans, members of Sinn Féin, would be in government. It was a power-sharing agreement, all right? So, and here's the key issue. If you want an ethnic conflict to be solved, it's no good just getting a majority of the people in that country to agree to it. You've really got to get a majority of the people in each ethnic group to agree to it, all right? And the great worry at the time was that amongst unionists who didn't like certain aspects of it, we were not going to get enough unionists to agree to it, and therefore the agreement would lack legitimacy with the biggest community in Northern Ireland. Now, and I was part of it. I was busy campaigning and climbing lampposts and doing all sorts of things that I won't even start to go into now. But we got more than 50% of unionist support for the agreement. And that fundamentally gave it legitimacy to be carried on. And we then had difficult but extraordinary years. You'll see that picture at the top of Martin McGuinness, who was senior Sinn Féin and IRA member, with Ian Paisley, who was the most vociferous unionist over the previous 40 years. And I can tell you that to see those two people sitting together at the time was quite extraordinary. It often gets said about peace processes that the difficult thing about peace process is you are not making peace with your friends, you're making peace with your enemies. All right. And that really is the challenge of trying to create peace. And for those two to end up sitting as first and deputy first minister really was quite extraordinary. Actually, in 98, Ian Paisley opposed it. He only came on board in 2007 after a second agreement called the St Andrews Agreement. So the IRA ended its campaign. We had decommissioning. So the IRA got rid of its guns and the British Army left the street. It was called Operation Banner since 1969. In fact, it was the longest operation in British Army history. So the troops, the gun left Northern Ireland in that sense. And that was the huge relief to so many people. So what did this agreement look like? Well, it's like all agreements. It's got lots of wording, which takes some looking at and is deeply problematic and sometimes means different things to different people. And maybe that's sometimes why agreements work, because both people think they've got what they wanted. This is the sort of romantic citizenship ideal in it. that both governments affirm whatever choice is freely exercised by a majority of the people in Northern Ireland, the power of the sovereign government with jurisdiction there shall be exercised with rigorous impartiality on behalf of all the people and the diversity of their identities and traditions, and shall be founded on the principles of full respect and equality of civil, political, social and cultural rights, of freedom of discrimination of all citizens, of parity of esteem, and just of equal treatment for the identity, ethos and aspirations of both communities. That is the key idea. The key idea is that we had to make sure everybody was treated as equal citizens, regardless of whether they saw themselves as Irish and wanting a united Ireland or British and wanting to stay within the United Kingdom. We hadn't had that up until then. Many nationalists have felt excluded from the system, and this agreement gave them that. However, even this agreement, and I've highlighted it here, there are some interesting and problematic contradictions. So you can see halfway through the paragraph, it talks about the people in the diversity of their identities and traditions. And by the bottom, we've got the aspirations of both communities. So we've gone from diversity to two communities in four lines there. So, and that has all sorts of implications, not all of which I'm going to go into now, but it's an interesting part of the agreement. So what did all this mean? Put simply, Northern Ireland remains a part of the United Kingdom, all right, and it won't change until a majority of the people in Northern Ireland vote in a referendum for that to change, all right? And that was a huge thing for Irish nationalists and Republicans to sign up to, because broadly it signed up to the consent principle, which kept Northern Ireland in existence. All right. So in other words, Republicans who had fought for 30 years decided they would accept some political structures, if you like, British rule in Ireland. So that was an enormous thing for them to do. And a change would only take place if a referendum takes place, and there are various systems for recognizing when a referendum would take place, and some you might like to ask me at the end the likelihood of that taking place. And the Irish Constitution was amended on that basis. Now, so what did we end up with? This is the structure, this is the system. We ended up with a 108-member assembly, which has now been reduced to 90, so it's got less than it did in 98. And here's the key: we have a cross-community voting system. So for something to be passed through legislation, the MLAs, when they go in there, define themselves as either nationalist or unionist or other. And for a piece of legislation to be passed, you have to get at least 40% of both nationalist and unionist communities. So in other words, there's a potential block on anything that's seen as discriminatory or sectarian going through the assembly. So we have a system of power sharing within the assembly. Now, that of course, and you'll already probably be seeing through the problems, and you in America know all about political systems which appear to have great balance, but in the end get you stuck, all right? Is of course getting anything through the assembly which gets the agreement of both sides becomes awfully difficult. All right. So although it gives power sharing, it also has inbuilt problems in working. Similarly, we have ministries. So our government, depending on how many votes each party gets, it has a right to a seat in government through what's called the Divison system, which the Belgians invented. And anybody who wants to know about ethnic politics and governance, you need to look at Belgium at some point in time. So that means actually all 5 of our political parties at present have seats in government. So we have an enforced coalition, all right? Everybody has a share of power, which of course at one level is great. At another level, needless to say, means it makes governing very, very difficult, because getting agreement, and we have had long spells where our government wasn't working. In fact, we've just come out of a 3-year spell when the government couldn't even agree on how to work. And we came back with an agreement in January, all right? Now, certain power, Westminster still retains certain powers in Northern Ireland. We also have a lot of north-south bodies. So we share a lot of bodies with the Republic of Ireland, because part of the agreement is that things like tourism, as a good example, works on an all-Ireland basis. So if you receive tourist literature, it will cover Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And one of the great changes in the time I've lived here is the flow of people from Dublin to Belfast, the ease of which one goes across the border, a border which used to be a military border and is now non-existent. Now, Brexit, of course, might change that. But that's been one of the great changes, the sense in which that border, which is a real political international border, is almost non-existent when you go through it. So there's an all-island dimension to it as well. All right. As important in trying to create peace was the role of human rights and dealing with key issues that come out of conflict. So perhaps one of the most important things was the incorporation of the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law in the 1998 Human Rights Act, which came into law in 2000. We also have a Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, and it has oversight over how people's rights are being dealt with in Northern Ireland. That was an extremely important development, both judicially in the UK, but also particularly within Northern Ireland. We have a very strong Equality Commission with extremely strong powers to try and deal with things like employment or education or any areas where they feel there's inequality. They can take legal cases. So a strong Equality Commission. We had a Northern Ireland Victims Commission. In fact, we've had 2 or 3. Because, of course, we had large numbers of victims. And I would say that's the most overriding long-term problem we've had to deal with in Northern Ireland. How do you deal with those people who are victims? How do you deal with the legal cases that are still ongoing? What about the people who lost loved ones and never found out who the killers were? How do you deal with truth and justice after that period that you've had? And that problem, and I'm not going to go into a long explanation, has lived with us ever since and has sort of been not being able to deal with it has been a poison within the system over the last 20 years. Fantastically successfully, by 2007, we had decommissioning. So all of the major paramilitary groups gave up their guns, and that was a big plus. So the IRA decommissioned its weapons, and eventually the UDA, the loyalist ones, and UVF did. We also had, and this I throw out to you in America as a thought, we had a very successful reworking of the police force from the Royal Ulster Constabulary into the Police Service of Northern Ireland. It was a highly contentious issue, but we managed to, using quite a lot of American academics and American police officers, we had the Patent Commission to restructure how policing worked in Northern Ireland. And I sometimes wonder when I look at your issues over policing in America, whether some people could go back to this report in 2000 and read it and find really useful stuff for police reform, really useful stuff, which was written originally by quite a lot of Americans. I just throw that one out to you. And of course, and this was probably the most controversial bit, we had prisoner releases. We had members of the UVF, the UDA, and the IRA and the INLA released from prison early. Some of them for people who committed, terrible crimes. And that was extraordinary. It was totally necessary to end the conflict, but extraordinarily difficult for people who had lost loved ones. And the example I throw out there, just to make you think about it, is of course the Oklahoma bomb, which the blowing up of that government building by Timothy McVeigh. The American state, of course, put Timothy McVeigh to death. What happens if, to create a peace process, people had decided that after 4 years, Timothy McVeigh would be released? That I put it like that because that is what people have to deal with in a peace process, and that is what makes it so difficult to push through. So what were the positive bits? We got a massive reduction in organized political violence. All right, there were lots of implications for that, but even by the last few years, the conflict in the early 90s, 70 and 80 people were being killed a year. There was often 1 or 2 a week being killed and all of that disappeared. And that has been and the Belfast I live in now is so massively better than it was. And I lived through half of the Troubles. And it's so much of a better city to bring your children in now, and it's a fantastic thing, and it is an achievement. And we got decommissioning of weapons, and we got agreed policing. We got broad political agreement that we would we would run our own affairs in Northern Ireland. We would be therefore broadly separate from Westminster and the rest of the United Kingdom, in what's called devolution. And that has been moderately successful. It's had its issues, but moderately successful. Again, Brexit has implications for that. It's got its problems. Stormont government is enforced coalition. So in other words, when these different political groups from nationalist and unionist side get into government, they then have to produce a program for government by working together, even though that program for government will look very different for what they claim to the electors they were going to do. Do you see what I mean? It's quite a challenge for politicians to try and make that system work. All right. We had at the time an economic boom. We now know that part of it was built on a fake credit and bank boom, but you'll know all about that, which collapsed in 2008 and was on the back of an Irish economy. So one of the stories, which I'm not going to go into now, but I'll throw out there, is Ireland has become a very different place in the last 30 years. The nature of the Irish state, of the Irish Republic, is so different. It's become socially so much more liberal. It's become economically more successful. It's a very different place than the Ireland from its inception in Republic, its inception, well, as era in 1921, it became the Republic in 1948-49, to the 70s and 80s. So one of the interesting things, for instance, the collapse of the legitimacy of the Irish Catholic Church in Ireland is a story all of its own. And we got improved economy in Northern Ireland. We got lower unemployment. And we got low wages. I mean, some of the sorts of employment have not been great, but the economy is very, very different up until recently. We're like you, got all sorts of things to face up to now. Also, and this is the bit that I look on, the space became shared. So Belfast, the centre of Belfast, which had been predominantly a unionist space, is now a much more welcoming space for everybody. We had our first St. Patrick's Day, public St. Patrick's Day in 1998 in the city. Republicans and nationalists, if they want to demonstrate, can go and do it in the centre of the city. They can wave their tricolours. And indeed, in the last 20 years, we probably had 6 now or 7 Republicans who are mayor of Belfast. So in that sense, the civic nature of the city has become shared. But we have some significant issues. We have fundamental divisions in housing. So if you visit Belfast, you can visit areas which are 90% Protestant, 90% Catholic, and you have interfaces. I just have to cross the road about 200 yards from where I am now, and I'm going from a broadly Catholic area to a broadly Protestant area. All right. And that's all over Belfast. And that is embedded in that, or part of that, is that our education system is broadly a state Protestant system and a Catholic school system. There are some integrated schooling, and people like integrated schooling, but broadly it's controlled by those two systems. And that means that not only kids grow up in their area, they're also taught in schools in their area. And many people, there are quite a lot of critics, including myself, of a lack of integration in society. And of course, the political parties that have represented these groups have also remained strong. That is Sinn Féin and the SDLP, representing Catholic community, and the Ulster Unionist Party and the Democratic Unionist Party representing the Unionists and the Protestant community. And so we have structural fissures within our society, which we still struggle with. As I mentioned, victims and survivors has been an issue, and truth and justice. So what does reconciliation look like? How do we reconcile these differences? And I'll finish up with just a few comments of that in a minute. And we've had any number of agreements since to try and deal with problem. We had an American diplomat, Richard Haas, over in the 2016-17, who set up a number of things, including a commission that I ended up chairing. We've recently had a new agreement called New Decade, New Approach that has again got the government going again. But these have been ongoing issues which we've struggled with over the last 20 years. And I'll just finish with a few pictures and a few thoughts. What we have a lot of, and you are very familiar with this in America because you're going through a phase of it yourselves at the moment, is what some people call a culture war. And that is a conflict over how we represent our identities, our history in the public space. And you've gone through a very particularly interesting period of that in the US over the last couple of months. It's been an ongoing feature of Northern Ireland in its whole life, but particularly in the last 20 years. Disputes over flags, disputes over memorials, bonfires, the naming of parks. I won't go into them all, but you could not pick up a newspaper any day in Northern Ireland without finding one of these sort of symbolic disputes that are taking place somewhere or another. This is one example from the end of my road, the bottom of the Antrim Road. This is a statue you can see on your left. If you read a very recently well-received book, The Milkman, it's all set in this area of North Belfast. The statue was to a Protestant minister who, I have to say, having read some of his sermons from the 19th century, was particularly vicious and sectarian, but nevertheless, apparently he was good with education systems. He got a statue in 1901, and in 1970, the IRA blew it up, and now that statue is missing from the centre of Carlisle Circus. Now you can see there's a rather odd piece of public art left. I could repeat those stories all over Northern Ireland. In fact, that's the map of where I live. I live just up, if my pointer comes out, I lived up the Antrim Road, somewhere up in this corner here. But everywhere we went, you can get bonfires. So the orange coloured bits are the Unionist or Protestant areas. The green coloured bits are the Catholic areas, the city of the centre down here. And I could take you on a walk around this area and show you how the space is divided up and symbolically imagined in these particular areas. You've got Republican flags here in the New Lodge. You've got Loyalist bands marching down the road. In fact, you've got Republican band there, interestingly, marching past an Orange Hall. If you could see all of that picture, that would be William of Orange on top of Belfast Orange Hall. You've got flags on flag poles there. And that's a constant part of our... So whilst we have peace, we do struggle with an ongoing territorial division within the city. So to sort of draw things to a conclusion before questions, what I'm describing, I think, is pretty nice. I think Belfast, I think Northern Ireland has never been more divided and more shared at the same time. What do I mean by that? So in residential terms, we remain hugely divided. All right, schooling terms, in institutional politics terms. However, in terms of the use of space and civic centres and sharing of political institutions and sharing of financial resources, we've become very good at sharing and cohesion. So we have this strange mix of a deeply divided society, all right, which has found ways of being cohesive. So it's all about the management of division, or what sometimes gets called transitional justice, or transitioning conflict. So the conflict has not gone away. What we've done is we've transitioned the nature of a conflict into a political space that can be managed. And it's not always easy to manage, but we can manage it. So I'm arguing that we've got a type of peace. We haven't solved the fundamental problems in Ireland at all, but what we have done is we found peaceful ways for those political differences to coexist. Now, there are all sorts of challenges, and I'm going to end up, and I spoke at the end of last week about the challenge which we've had recently, which is Brexit, whereby the European Union, which has provided a broad envelope, political and economic envelope, with which both Britain and the Republic of Ireland sits, of course, is now disappearing because the UK is leaving the EU, much to my disappointment, I have to say. But Northern Ireland will stay within the economic sector of the EU. So they're very complicated. And that's because Northern Ireland is a very complicated part of the United Kingdom. And frankly, there were quite a lot of politicians in Britain who, when they went for Brexit, did not fully understand the consequences of what that meant for Northern Ireland. So the challenges remain. On the whole, I have it's a nice story to tell about a place which was violently assailed and very difficult to live in, becoming a place which is peaceful. And frankly, if any of you over here, always welcome showing people around, because it's such an interesting place and space, and a beautiful place as well. Belfast is beautiful, it's industrial and I love it, but it's a beautiful place as well. So that, I think that's my conclusion there of the story. So I think I'm going to quickly hand over to Matt to see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Tom. Our first question is from Miles. He asks, do residents of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland have the same passport? If so, could residents of Northern Ireland request a British passport for dual citizenship?
Yes, they can. Yeah, you can get away with all of that, Miles. The rule is that if you live in Northern Ireland, you can get if you were born in Northern Ireland. So I couldn't get an Irish passport. All right. My children could get an Irish passport. You can have either a British or Irish passport. So that's one of the important things about the agreement. It recognizes your citizenship as both being British or Irish in equal measure. And if I go down to the post office, I could pick up a form for an Irish passport or a form for a British passport. And indeed, I have to say, there are no two states in the world closer than the United Kingdom, the Republic of Ireland. For all of the last century, anybody from Ireland who wanted to go to Britain immediately gets the right to the British citizen. They can use the health system, they can vote almost immediately. So one of the things that we've been able to do is recognize our countries are so close together and give people rights to that effect. So you can have passports to both. Yes, definitely.
Okay. So Carol, who participated in a Rhodes Scholar program in Northern Ireland about 5 years ago, asks about the wall murals, which I think you're very familiar with. So
Yep.
Have the wall murals painted around the city influenced the peace process, or the type of peace that we have now?
Well, I think it's a two-way process, because firstly, has the peace process influenced the murals? And the answer is yes. The images on them have changed over a period of time. I mean, if in sense, murals are more interestingly fluid, if a painting on a wall can be fluid, than a statue, because they do need repainting, and the way the images get progressed over time means that it reflects the politics of the time. So when the Republican murals started in the 80s, you'd have had lots of hooded gunmen because the IRA were defending their community. All right. By the time you get to the 1990s and 1990s, they're memorializing their soldiers, their IRA soldiers, so their faces appear on the walls without masks on. So you've got the second part is that those murals become a way of influencing people. All right, so they become a message board. However, I have to say that what's been noticeable in the last 20 years is that lots of the murals are being painted for the outsider. So you, the visitor, you, the Rhodes Scholar that's coming to Northern Ireland, they're being painted really to give messages to the outsider, because both groups have wanted to sell their story to the tourist visitor. And it's so interesting to have seen. I started doing tours in the 1998, and now all of the red buses go round the murals. And so in some senses, the type of the message, the people they're aiming the message at has changed over that period of time.
I'd love to go on one of those tours, Dom. So this is a question from Priscilla. She asks, how do you teach the history of the IRA and terrorist groups to students?
Oh, Priscilla. It's very difficult. First of all, I'm an anthropologist, not a historian. And in some senses, I'm quite a critic of how history is taught. Okay. But I run courses called Introduction to Northern Ireland. So I do teach elements of history, and I'm very careful about the language I use. So for example, controversial though this might be, the word terrorism is hopeless. All right. I would take it out of the lexicon because it really doesn't understand the complexities of political violence and the reasons why people do things. All right. And it's usually a term used by the state to describe people it doesn't like or disagree with. And to name an obvious example of the American Revolution, your American revolutions, which are now lauded in shows like Hamilton, were to the British state effectively terrorists of their day. So for that reason, I think you've got to understand why people, I'm not morally defending the violence that is used. All right. I've got my own problems, but I think you've got to understand why people are conducting the violence they are. So I'm not defending it. I'm not saying that they don't have to see the law, but as a teacher, I've got to try and teach children to understand why did people join the IRA in 1968, 69? British soldiers often get a very negative call, but a lot of them were 17 or 18-year-olds who joined the British Army in England and suddenly find themselves on the streets of Belfast or the streets in Derry. There's a movie called 1971, called 71. Watch that movie. That's got a very interesting story of a young English soldier finding himself on the streets of West Belfast. And I think it does a good job of trying to understand the way that violence was constructed. So I hope that's not too much of a complicated question, but I think the answer is you've got to do it sensitively and with empathy to all groups.
Mary says in 2010, she went on a Rhodes Scholar program and they spent a day visiting an integrated primary school.
Yeah.
Since 2010, have those increased or decreased? And have they been successful in bringing the two sides together?
I think that, Mary, I think that's a bit of a sad story. I mean, I'm a great supporter of integrated education. If I had my way, that's the first thing. If anybody ever voted for me, even my children probably wouldn't vote for me. If anybody ever voted for me, integrated education is what I would be pushing. But think of what that involves. That involves saying to the Catholic Church in Northern Ireland or in Ireland that you no longer have control over the education system. And you can imagine, particularly with an English accent like me, I mean, I'm brought up a Catholic, but you can imagine how huge that is. All right. So actually, it's still around 5 or 6% of people go to integrated schools, and it's been moderately successful. It is part of our program for government to encourage integrated school. Our local primary, we're trying to get integrated at the moment, but I wouldn't say since you were here 10 years, we've moved along massively from that, even though it might appear a good answer.
Dick wants to know, do younger people tend to be less sectarian and antagonistic than their parents?
I think the answer is no, unfortunately. I think we all love to think that the young will grow up and somehow not, but they're still growing up in all of those conditions which I described. Now, what I do think is that increasingly young people are becoming disinterested. They're involved in all sorts of other forms of identity. I mean, just to give you one thing, we have a huge Pride event. In fact, our Pride event in Belfast is probably bigger than St. Patrick's Day or the 12th of July now. And the kids love going down to those events. It's a carnival, it's a party. And so I think there's been a rise in those significant sorts of identity. However, I was cycling back up the road 2 days ago, and there were groups of Catholics and Protestant kids at an interface, and the police Land Rover was sitting there. And, there are still big issues, and the way people think about the world is still very sectarian. So I'm not particularly convinced that I could describe young people as less sectarian than their parents.
Very interesting. So Pride is an opportunity, almost a holiday where people get together, or the differences are less.
Yes, if you think about it, we all have lots of different sorts of identities. And what's so striking about Northern Ireland is this Protestant Catholic identity, this unionist nationalist identity seems to trump everything. But of course, there's loads of other potential identities out there. The football teams you support, all sorts of things, your gender and sexuality, the games that you play that create difference, the bands, the music that you like. When I go to a rock concert, I'm sitting in a big auditorium, and I suspect if it's a big, concert, whatever the big band is at the moment, and there's big Protestants and Catholics standing side by side around that identity. When I went and watched Neil Young last year, fantastic concert. Nobody worked out or needed to work out whether he was a Protestant or a Catholic standing next to you, listening to Neil Young fire away on that guitar. So what I'm saying is there are lots of spaces where we're not forced into that orange and green division. And I think that's been important in getting increasing cohesion in the place.
Interesting. Well, to tie in with that, William has a question. When you meet someone and your name doesn't unambiguously identify your social group, do you feel the need to correct what incorrect assumption the other person might be thinking?
William, and with a name like William, you're just the right person to answer that, because for those that don't know, William is a classic Protestant name here, and I'm called Dominic, so I've got a classic Catholic name. And if we were to meet William in Northern Ireland, we'd soon be finding out, trying to work each other out. And I think the answer to that is yes. So I, in the work I do, I need to get on with all the communities, and I probably all the time am trying to present that I understand that community. So, for instance, I'm from a Catholic background. I'm an atheist these days, but I'm from a Catholic background. Everybody knows that because I've got a name like Dominic. But I've written a book on the Orange Order, the loyalist marching organisation that remembers William of Orange. So I'm sure I found ways. I know I found ways when I was interviewing Orangemen to make them feel comfortable that I'm somebody they could trust, despite the fact that I have a name like Dominic. And I think we all do that all the time. So I'm not unusual. In our societies, even all the societies, we find ways of building relationships with people that make them comfortable. So yes, I think that takes place all the time. And I certainly am no different from anybody else in doing that.
So Dom, stepping out of Ireland and looking at the United States, we have a question from Doreen. So do you have any suggestions for us in the United States with our current issues?
Well, I mean, I'm lucky. I've been very lucky over the years because I was director of Irish Studies at Queen's for 14 years, and I probably visited the United States at least twice a year for much of the last 2 decades.
Do we need a flag? Do we need a flag commission as well?
Well, do you know, you have had them. I mean, there was a commission in Charlottesville over the statues there. There had been a commission and it had come to findings, but the courts had stopped the findings taking place. There was a process for removing those statues and putting them in other places, because I met all the people on that commission. So in some senses, there were processes taking place. What I would say is this. We come from a deeply divided society, and increasingly I viewed the United States in that way. And that binding one society together is a very, very difficult issue. And the US is dealing with some fundamental problems with the nature of its state, it seems to me. And I mean, just to throw one problem out there, the militarization of policing in America is extraordinary. Your police officers go around armed and protected in the way that our police officers went around in the Troubles. So we can see military style vehicles being used on policing tells you you've got problems in your society. Now, they're not insolvable. All right. America has a great history, and it always seems to me to have the foundations. If you'll forgive me, America has the right ideas. I think its delivery over the years has been disappointing, if that's not a bad way of putting it. So I do think if one goes back to some of those fundamental ideas of citizenship, that there are solutions to be had. And I do think, looking at some of the divided societies, America supplied loads of money. America supplied solutions for us. We had George Mitchell taking part. We have a lot to thank America for. All right. But I do honestly think that sometimes in some of these issues, looking at our divided society and see some of the ways that we've attempted to manage it, not always successfully, will provide interesting solutions. And that's why I've been in the States looking at some of the statue issues. What do you do about this history which becomes so contested? How do you reframe that history? And some of that, by the way, will mean taking statues down, as we have done, and putting them in museums and putting them in different places and putting new statues up. That's an inevitable part of a society evolving.
So thank you for that. Just a time for a few more questions. So please explain, please explain the problem with Brexit. We've got a lot of questions, but I think specifically, are you afraid that there will be a hard border in the future?
Yes, I am afraid of that. That's one of my great fears, because it seems to undermine the success of the peace agreement. But here's the irony, and I can't go into all of the details because, oh boy, I can't tell you how much we've raked over this over the last 4 or 5 years. But the only real way of dealing with the border, and the British government has always known this, is that the border, the customs border is not going to be the land border. It's going to be a border between Ireland, north and south, and the rest of Britain. And that's what we've come to the agreement. And the odd thing was that unionists supported Brexit, even though most of us could see that the British government at the end of the day was going to have to produce customs checkpoints between Northern Ireland and Scotland, and Northern Ireland and England. And that's what's happening. They're building them down in the Belfast port at the moment, which would seem, from my point of view, to be a really odd thing for the unionists to end up with. So unionists got their Brexit. Britain is more independent from Europe. But what they've also got is an economic unit of Ireland, which is now separate from the United Kingdom and stays, Northern Ireland stays within the European common market effectively for customs reasons. So I think probably analogies of shooting oneself in the foot is not the right sort of thing, but unionists made mistakes. So it's going to be very interesting to see, but I think, no, we won't see a border. I hope we won't see a land border, but it will be very destabilizing in the years to come, I think.
Okay, and so the last question, and again, it's been a pleasure. In the last lecture, Dom, you talked about your favorite pub that you now get to go to. Have you been back to that pub since we last
do you know what? I haven't. I've got one down the end of the road, which is called the American, which is owned by one of my oldest friends in Northern Ireland. I haven't been back down there yet. I've been a bit nervous. I've got kids and a big family, and I haven't been rushing out to the pub. But I do plan to go this weekend. There's another one called the Sunflower in the centre of town, which is also a favourite of mine. And we've got one right close to us on the interface, a new one called the Ben Madigan, and I will be getting a Guinness from there this weekend.
Okay. Well, Dom, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you in the future, hopefully.
Look
Good luck
forward to it.
Thank you.